Well, if you've clicked on this video today, it's safe to assume it's because you do want the truth about HDR.
You want answers?
But the simple truth about HDR is that it is in fact fantastic. HDR images can look absolutely jaw-dropping, and you can now enjoy HDR in the home. That's been the case for a few years, whether it's from a physical source like a 4K Blu-ray, which is what I mainly cover on this channel, or if you're into streaming, you can enjoy HDR from Netflix now, Amazon Prime, Disney Plus, the list goes on and on. But sadly, this can't be said for everyone. Everyone views HDR differently depending on the tech. You know, they might be constrained by the budget, whether they're viewing it on a projector or on a TV or on a gaming monitor even. It varies for everyone from person to person. And in some cases, if you don't get that right, it can leave you really underwhelmed and you might be put off HDR and you don't want to explore further. The reason I wanted to make this video today was because I was one of those guys. 4 years ago, I got into this kind of stuff seriously, home cinema, enjoying my movies to the fullest, and obviously 4K HDR was the newest advancement. And I didn't do my research basically, and I had to go through 3 different TVs, wasting money every time, upgrading to the next model, chasing the correct tech to give me the HDR experience, the 4K HDR experience that I really dreamt of and that I thought was going to be so good in my home. And I did get there in the end, but it was a costly journey to get there, and I'm trying to educate you guys out there, people like me 4 years ago, beginners, want to find out as much as they can about HDR, and hopefully in this relatively short video, be able to guide you guys through some of the pitfalls that I ultimately succumbed to when I started my HDR journey, so to speak. But if it's too late, and as you're watching the video, you come to the realization that you've already fallen into some of those pitfalls, then fret not, because at the end, I'll give some quick tips on how you can alleviate some of those problems and get a better HDR experience out of the set you're currently using. And if that's not enough for you, I'll also give some recommendations on what TVs I think you should buy. So stick around and we'll get straight into the truth about HDR after the break. What's going on, folks? Welcome to the channel. I'm Andy, your Electricgeek, and on this channel I mainly cover 4K Blu-ray. I also do steelbook unboxings, 4K Blu-ray reviews and rankings as well. And I'll also cover some of the tech associated with 4K Blu-ray, so that's your 4K Blu-ray players, TVs, and I touch on a little bit of gaming, so PS5 as well. So if that's something that you're into, please consider subscribing to the channel for more of my future content. So the quickest way to explain what HDR is to look no further than the sticker that's on the front of your 4K Blu-rays. You know, that little metallic, shiny sticker that's on the cellophane, and it says brighter, deeper, more lifelike colour. And that in a nutshell is it, but obviously there's a bit more to it. I'm not going to do a massive deep dive into it. I'm not an expert calibrator or anything like that. The aim of this video is to just give beginners and newcomers to the kind of AV community, if you like, the kind of key facts so that you can make informed decisions about the equipment you buy so you get that HDR experience you're hoping for. So that basically is it in a nutshell. So when you're talking about explosions in action movies, gunfire, searing suns or really bright moons against a dark background, you're going to get them much brighter than you would do in SDR content. And then when you move on to the darker stuff, so like nighttime scenes, the blacks are going to be really, really inky black, but there's going to be more variation and depth in them so they can show better shadow detail, so the gradation is going to be better. And that's ultimately what HDR is all about. However, many TVs can receive and process a HDR signal, but it depends on what's in the TV, the guts, the processing, how the backlight works. Whether it's an OLED TV or an LED TV, this is ultimately what's going to determine how good that HDR image looks on your screen and whether or not it's doing the technology justice. And ultimately, it's satisfying to you to watch. As well as the brighter highlights and the better, deeper blacks and whatnot, you also have a wider spectrum of colour. So previously in SDR content, we used to use a thing called 8-bit technology, colour technology if you like, and that resulted in 17 million different colours. Now you imagine when a director or a creator is filming something, obviously in real life there are an infinite possibility of colours basically, but we've always been limited technology-wise as to what we can actually capture, compress down and then put onto a cinema screen or onto a TV, whatever that may be. But technology's getting better and better and we can capture a wider array of what's actually being exposed to the camera. So with HDR, we use 10-bit colour depth. Now this results in over 1 billion different colours. So that means that you can get much more nuanced colours. Things aren't going to be maybe that little bit overly saturated, or not going to be as unrealistic in some SDR presentations of movies or TV shows. With HDR, you're going to get a much more lifelike representation of what that content actually looks like when it was shot by the director or the filmmaker. And this is ultra important because ultimately this is what my channel is about. If you're watching my channel, chances are it's because you love movies and TV shows and you want to be moved by them as much as possible. You want to get the creator's intent on the screen and you want to consume that, and that's ultimately what it's about. So that's why HDR is such a great technology and tool, because it gets us, the movie fans, the viewers, closer to the creator's intent, and we can watch things as they're supposed to be watched. It's arguably a much bigger advancement than 4K is. They get used in tandem, 4K HDR, but if you ask anyone that knows anything about it, any enthusiast like me, they'll probably tell you that HDR has the bigger wow factor than the actual 4K resolution itself. But when they work together, that's when the magic happens. So we'll touch a bit more on the tech side of things in just a few minutes, but firstly we'll speak about the different formats. So the original format is known as HDR10. Every single HDR TV, if it's got a HDR logo on it, it means that it can receive a HDR10 signal. HDR10 is free to use, so manufacturers don't have to pay any kind of licensing fee to any owner as such. It's a free standard which any manufacturer can use. Then you go into Dolby Vision, which you may have heard of, and then you have HDR10 Plus. HDR10 Plus was developed mainly by Samsung, who obviously are a massive manufacturer of TVs, and they kind of own the rights along with other third-party agencies. I can't remember who they are, but you'll tend to find that if you have a Samsung TV, or if you look at Samsung's, that is the kind of advanced HDR format that they use and support because they developed it themselves, so they've obviously stuck to their guns by that and they've tried to kind of run with that. However, pretty much every other brand, so Sony, LG, Panasonic, all these different household names, they've all gone with Dolby Vision, and some have went with HDR10 Plus as well. So some manufacturers like Panasonic and LG will cover all bases if that's important to you. But the difference with Dolby Vision ultimately and HDR10 Plus is that, certainly from the manufacturing point of view, is that they have to pay a licensing fee to Dolby for Dolby Vision, or to Samsung and its subsidiaries for HDR10 Plus. I won't go into too much detail about Dolby Vision and HDR10 Plus, that maybe is for another video, but just to put it bluntly, the difference over HDR10 is that HDR10, the brightness levels and the nits, which we'll talk about in a minute, that they use is kind of capped, and it's a one size fits all for the whole movie, so the whole 2 hour movie, whereas with Dolby Vision and HDR10 Plus, that changes literally on a frame by frame basis, so there's a lot more control there, and they can vary the brightness and the darkness per scene, just to give you a much more nuanced and a much more tailored image throughout, if you like. Dolby Vision can hit a crazy high level of brightness with regards to nits, but TVs and displays haven't actually been able to catch up with that capability yet. It can also handle 12-bit colour, which is getting into stupid amounts of colour, but again, the technology hasn't actually caught up with it yet, but that's all there for when we finally do catch up. But that's enough about Dolby Vision and HDR10 Plus. It's just to give you an idea of the different formats that are out there. So when it comes to actually displaying HDR efficiently though and getting the absolute best out of it, I believe there are 3 kind of technical aspects we have to talk about with regards to tech you'll be viewing it on, and that is brightness, the brightness capability of the TV, which is measured in nits, which I'll explain in a second, contrast ratio, and then finally the technology of the panel itself. So if it's a TV we're talking about, I'm talking about whether or not it's an LED TV, an OLED TV, mini LED, or QD OLED, you know, the list goes on and on. But these are the 3 aspects that we need to consider. So first up, we're going to talk about the brightness capability of the TV, and to do so I need to talk about nits and I kind of explain that first. So 1 nit is equal to 1 candela, so that means 1 candle power per square metre basically. I promise I'm not going to get any more technical than that, but to give it some reference, right, the sun at noon is equal to 1.6 billion candelas. So obviously your TV is not going to get anywhere near 1.6 billion. But but just to give you some reference when I start throwing the figures at you. So the absolute kind of bare minimum that you need really, even just to have a HDR TV, so I'm talking your really low end 4K HDR TVs, is about 400 to 450 nits. Now HDR content, movies, TV shows, is currently mastered mainly around about the 1000 nit range. So that means the brightest imagery on the TV screen is mastered to 1000 nits, and the lowest being whatever, like 100 nits. So if your TV is only capable of 400, then right away, it's not going to be able to give you that dynamic range of brightness that's advertised on the front of your 4K Blu-ray, and that's nothing to do with the film or the 4K Blu-ray, it's just simply that your TV can't actually display that. So it's going to have to clip the highlights. So there's not going to be a huge difference between, say, that explosion and the normal brightness of the scene, and that's why brightness is so important. So further to that, there's even a standard that's been put together by filmmakers, manufacturers, everybody that's involved in the kind of home video and cinema world, that have put together a standard which they deem to be premium. So there's some criteria that has to be met. I'm reading off my iPad here just because it's quite technical. So firstly, it must be able to give a minimum resolution of 4K, which is pretty self-explanatory, pretty obvious. Then it must be able to do 10-bit colour, which is what I touched on earlier. That's giving you that 1 billion different colour variations. Deep colour as it's known. There are recognised colour spaces which the TV must be able to produce 90% of that range. So that's going back to, you know, the lifelike colours that I was talking about earlier. But we'll not go into that too much on this video. But more relevant to what we're speaking about is the minimum dynamic range. So there's two criteria, there's two options it gives you here, and that's because of the different technologies when it comes to the TVs themselves. So option one is more than 1000 nits of peak brightness. This is so that it can cover that range that I was talking about earlier that is in most HDR content, and less than 0.05 nits of black level. Now obviously black should be black, it shouldn't be bright at all, and that's why that number is so small when it comes to, you know, the brightness. So that refers really to your LED TVs. Now because of their technology, they can get super bright, but obviously they don't have infinite blacks like OLEDs, which I'll get into in a second. So the second option is for your OLED type technologies. So you only need a minimum brightness of 540 nits, which is only half of that capability, as I explained earlier, up to taking 1000 as your ceiling. But it's a lot more strenuous when it comes to the black level because OLED can produce almost infinite blacks, almost infinite contrast I should say, and that number is 0.0005 nits of black level. But you'll notice basically as the brightness drops, then the scrutiny for the black increases, and that's so that you're still getting that excellent contrast. Because basically what it's saying is, even though OLED's technology can't quite get to the maximum brightness when it's in a dark room and when it's offset against such deep blacks, which an LED, a brighter panel, just can't quite meet, then you're still getting that wow factor, that premium 4K HDR experience. So that's just to give you a bit of understanding and reference when it comes to the brightness levels and why that's important for your minimum dynamic range. And of course, look for the Ultra HD Premium logo on Blu-rays and TVs, and then you kind of know that you're safe if you're wanting the very best. So like I say, that covers the brightness and why that's important, and then that also covers contrast ratio, which if you remember was the second kind of key technical aspect that I wanted to talk about, and that's so that we can get that high dynamic range. And then third up is your panel type. Now this is where I basically went wrong. Four or 5 years ago, Black Friday, I went, right, that's it, I'm getting into the 4K HDR scene, and I just seen this Sony that was going for what I thought was a good price. It's certainly spec-wise covered all the boxes, which is a common pitfall, because just because it says on the box that it receives a signal doesn't mean it's going to output it, produce it well. So I bought that, got it home, got my first 4K HDR in, and I was like, it actually looks worse. It looked a bit washed out because the TV wasn't capable of displaying it properly, and basically it punched the overall brightness of the telly up. It couldn't locally dim, it didn't have the right contrast ratio, so everything just looked milky, and HDR actually looked worse than standard SDR, and that's what I ended up doing. I ended up just watching SDR on it because HDR was pretty much unwatchable. So I was pretty deflated at that because I had spent a good few £100 to get this. So next up, stayed on the same type of technology, so I should have mentioned that was an LED type technology TV panel, and I did my research this time and upgraded to a bigger TV Still an LED, but this time I went for a different type of panel. So before I had an IPS panel, which doesn't produce great contrast, great for wide viewing angles, but their characteristic is they have poor contrast ratios, and that's why ultimately I got a bad experience with HDR. So I took a jump up, traded my old TV in for another Sony 55-inch model up, and this uses what they call a VA panel. It doesn't have great viewing angles for off-axis viewing, but as long as you're in a small room and it's your cinema room and you're looking at it straight on, that technology type lends itself to much better contrast ratios. So again, this TV's brightness level wasn't anything massively different, to be honest, from the old one, but the contrast was better. So I did get better darkroom performance. The blacks were nice, but it didn't have the brightness to give me those bright explosions and, you know, to really get the use out of that 1000 nit master that was on the Blu-rays that I was watching. So I was still underwhelmed, and by this point I'd learned about OLED and the technology, and I knew exactly where I'd gone wrong, and I was sitting there itching to spend more money, and ultimately that is what I'd end up doing. So I ended up gifting that TV to my parents, and I ended up with an OLED. And once I got the OLED, I'd finally arrived at a very, 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 very good HDR experience, and I realised what all the fuss was about. But that cost me a lot of time and money. That took me years to finally get the HDR experience I wanted, and I learned that slowly by watching YouTubers, by reading God knows how many online articles, live streams, books, magazines, everything to eventually get there. So the idea is this short video is hopefully going to fast track you past all the kind of mistakes I made and make you somewhat of a HDR expert, hopefully within about 15-20 minutes. But as promised, I will give you some quick tips to help you out of a HDR jam if you're watching this video and realising, oh, my TV's not premium, it falls well below what you're saying, Andy, I've got a shit TV. There's no such thing as a shit TV, and there's no such thing as the perfect TV. There's just the TV that fits within your budget and delivers what you need it to deliver. But yeah, I'll give you some of my picks with regards to tech if you're wanting to get the best out of your HDR, and as I say, some tips to help you out on your existing set. So a really simple tip you can use, a lot of people complain that HDR, especially Dolby Vision, if the panel isn't bright enough to give you those peak highlights, they find the image can be very dull and dark and actually hard to make out. And that's because obviously in order for you to get those peak highlights, then the overall brightness level has to be a bit lower than what SDR content is. But if your TV can't get to those high levels of brightness, as I talked about earlier, then you're just going to have a dull image the whole way through. So there's a setting on your TV that you can change, and that's the gamma setting. If you increase the gamma slider up, it'll usually sit about the 0 mark. You can usually adjust it by 1, 1, 2, or -1, -2. If you adjust it to the right, as in up the way, 1, 2, you'll find the image gets lighter. So what that's doing is it's controlling, in layman's terms, it's controlling the relationship between the light and the dark. So it'll look a little bit washed out, but if you're sitting there struggling, you can't see anything anyway, then it doesn't harm to kind of slightly shift that balance towards the light, and you'll maybe be able to pick up some of the shadow detail, because you'll still be able to enjoy the wide spectrum of colour. It's just that you're not going to, with your limited set, it's just that you're not getting the brightness, but you still want to enjoy the wide spectrum of colour that HDR offers. So I would suggest playing about with the gamma setting, sliding that up, as I say, to lighten the overall image before you just ditch HDR altogether and go to SDR. If that's still not working for you, don't be scared to just not use it. If your TV is HDR in name only, then disable it or stick to your regular Blu-rays. Change the settings on your Blu-ray player so that it's outputting in SDR. You're still getting the 4K, but you're not getting the HDR, and you might find it looks better. That's obviously drastic, but it's something that you can do if HDR is just not working for you on your set. So that's my quick fix tips if you're struggling with HDR on your set. But if you're looking to upgrade your TV now, then here's some of my recommendations. Now, at the time of filming, this is the transition when we get all the new 2022 models. So yeah, I could obviously give you the recommendations for those. I will talk about them briefly, but those are going to be super expensive over the next couple of months, and you're not going to see any real dip in price probably until closer to Black Friday at that time. However, that being said, it is a very good time to buy the previous models, so the 2021 TVs. So I'm going to talk about some of those ones. Beforehand, I should say my experience, I'm mainly a bit of a Sony fanboy. I use Sony TVs. I think their processing's excellent, their upscaling's fantastic. I love the filmic, cinematic look and the design of their TVs. I just think they offer that little bit of a premium, and I prefer them over LG and Samsung models. I have experience of both those. I'm not knocking those brands. I've recommended an LG to one of my good friends just last year, the C10, and he loves it. But yeah, I'm going to talk about Sony TVs because that's what I know, that's what I use, so that's the recommendations that I'm going to give you. So if I was going to recommend to you the top Sony TV at the moment, you know, the showstopper TV at the moment, it would definitely be the A90J OLED from Sony. This is really, really expensive. I think the cheapest you'll get, well, you'll get a 55-inch for close to about the £2,000 mark. Obviously that's going to dip as they'll be trying to clear all the old stock to make room for the 2022 model, so it's a good time to buy. But admittedly, the A90J is very, very expensive. However, it uses heatsink technology so that it can get even brighter than most OLEDs up until that model could do. So one of the limitations of OLED is that they can sometimes seem a bit dim in comparison to their LED counterparts, but this kind of bridged the gap somewhat. So the A90J was a big step forward, and it's won loads of awards and people absolutely rave about it. I've not actually seen one myself, but certainly within the kind of community it's accepted that the A90J is a fantastic OLED, and that would be the kind of top recommendation. However, its little brother, if you like, the A80J, is the value pick. So that's kind of like the model that I've got but 2 generations on. Obviously there's been some big improvements. The picture processor has changed. They're now using the XR cognitive processor. It's all singing, all dancing. People are raving about that. And again, you're getting the almost infinite contrast and, you know, that fantastic HDR performance. But you'll be able to get a 65-inch. I mean, at the moment, you can get the 65-inch A80J for around £1,800. Expensive, I know, but if you want the A90J, for example, you're paying about £3,000. So that's the difference. I don't think there's a massive difference in picture quality. The average punter's not going to really notice that much, certainly not for £1,200 extra. So my pick for the Sony OLED certainly would be the A80J. You'll get that at a cracking price just now. If you prefer to go with the LED, you're a bit worried about screen burning and all that from OLEDs, or it's just slightly out with your price range, then I would recommend going for something like the X90J. So this is the model up of what I've got. It's kind of like, it's the second tier with regards to their kind of top spec 4K LED TV that Sony do, and it's a good middle of the road TV. It has excellent black levels for an LED TV. Again, it has the local array dimming, which full array local dimming, which my XH90 has. So you'll get those deep blacks and those highlights, the specular highlight that HDR can afford, and it has quite a good high peak brightness level, more so than what the XH90 did. It also has some gaming specs, so if you're into a bit of both like I am, then you'll get all the benefits that come with HDMI 2.1. You only get 2 ports on it, unfortunately, but that do HDMI 2.1, but with that you'll get all the latest bells and whistles for next gen gaming. So you'll get 4K running at 120Hz, and you'll also get VRR, variable refresh rate, as well as auto low latency mode, which basically just means that the TV will automatically switch to the game preset so that you get the lowest input lag possible for a nice responsive gaming experience. So that's my picks. You'll get a 60, I mean, I got the XH90 in Black Friday when that was the model that was out, for under £1,000, a 65-inch cracking Sony TV. I think I got it for 870 quid. Absolute steal at the time, and I'll imagine you'll get a similar price on the XJ90 if you just play your cards right and get some of that stock that's clearing. Just with regards buying your stuff, where I would recommend going is the Sony. If you're wanting Sony, go to the Sony Centre in Falkirk. Dean and his team there, I've bought TVs from Dean for a few years. Very, very good customer service, know what they're talking about, and very competitive. Shop local. If you're from Scotland, use the Sony Centre. They'll always price match and beat anything, and you also get the 5-year warranty on any model that they do. And he also does refurbished stock, so if those prices I've just mentioned are a little bit high for you, then just remember you can get A-graded refurbished stock easily from Dean and the team up in Falkirk, much easier than you'll get from anywhere else, I would suggest. Like Curry's and John Lewis don't really do those options, so definitely want to consider if you're wanting to join the Sony family. Anyway, that's my picks on the TVs. I hope you found that useful. I hope you found the video useful in general. If you've enjoyed the video today, you got some use out of it, then please consider hitting that like button at the very least. And if you've enjoyed the video and you want to know more about 4K Blu-ray, you want to join this little community we're forming around this Electricgeek channel, then please consider subscribing to the channel. I'm currently sitting on about 360. My goal is to hit 500 by July, which will be the channel's 1 year anniversary, and hopefully on to 1,000 by the end of the year. So why not jump aboard, jump on the channel bandwagon, and let's see if we can get to 500 and then ultimately 1,000. Alright, I've been Andy Electricgeek. If you've enjoyed this and you're now totally psyched about HDR and you're thinking about getting some 4K Blu-rays for maybe the new TV that you've went and bought or you're going to buy, then why not check out this video, which is coming shortly, and it's going to be my top 5 4K Blu-rays for HDR. Alright, see you in the next one.